Can we start with kind of this first principle that you've been talking about and what we should be aware of that's coming?
Sure. To put that in context, before we get into the cash part, yeah, I'm a global macro investor, and economics, markets, and politics and geopolitics all matter. And there were three things that are happening. You pointed them out. Three things that are happening in our lifetimes that never happened in my lifetime or our lifetimes, and that I learned before I have to study past periods. And those three things, as you point out, are the creation of a lot of debt and money. The second is the amount of internal conflict that we're having over money and values and what that's like. And the third is the changing world order with countries like China and Russia competing with the United States in a way that didn't exist before. So back to the point that you're making about that money, it's a basic thing. Everybody agrees we need more money and we need more spending. But if you spend more than you earn, you have to borrow. And that creates debt. But that at first it's credit, so it gives you buying power.
Right.
But you have to pay it back, and that becomes depressing. And so in order to avoid that, central banks can print money and buy it back, right? But when they do that, that depreciates the value of money. So what we had was a lot of money and credit go out to a lot of people, a lot of buying power. Everybody, when they got it, they thought, oh, that's great. And somehow they seem surprised that when they spend it, the prices of everything go up. Okay. But the truth is that if you divide the amount of money and credit that's used for spending by the quantity of goods produced, you can calculate, well, the prices will change. And so that's what's going on. And that's what went on in a giant wave, the Federal Reserve and the government together, a giant wave. And that produced a giant amount of inflation, a giant amount of inflation.
Is it 8.5% right now? Is that what it is?
Yeah, well, it depends. I mean, it depends which number you're using. It's between 7.5% if you use year over year, or if you take the core inflation rate, it's closer to 12, and it's it's rising. There's some temporary influence, but it's basically because of the amount of spending. You can measure the amount of spending, not because of the bottlenecks.
And for people that maybe are hearing this inflation and have been hearing this recently, before we finish the first point, for a lot of people, when I grew up, I never understood what inflation even meant. They didn't teach this to me in school. They weren't teaching this to me in high school, college. It really wasn't a thing that I learned. I just heard it and knew that people were worried about the cost of things increasing. Can you explain what that actually means to us? For someone who's making $70,000 a year in the Midwest, what does that mean to them?
Buying power is what matters, right? And so what happens is when inflation goes up faster than your other sources of income, you lose buying power.
Okay.
But what happens is somehow that seems more acceptable sometimes to people than if it was just taken out of your pocket. You see, if they, let's say, raise taxes or take it out of somebody's pocket, everybody complains, whoever's had the pocket taken out of. But if it comes through printing of money and everybody gets checks, it's more acceptable. But what happens is those who are holding money, like money market funds and bond funds, lose the buying power of that. So think about those bond funds. Those bond funds are like down about 10%, and inflation is up over, let's call it 8%. So they lost 18% of the buying power. Wow. So it relieves debt. we think of it as meaning higher prices, but to some extent, that's a rich man's perspective because they say, oh, now I have to pay more. But the reality is you don't get more stuff from that higher inflation. And so it bids it out of the hands of some people. And that hurts the people who are, who don't get it because it's really so that's what's going on. You lose buying power. And so we're seeing a time now where you're going to lose buying power to inflation. And now you're going to see the Federal Reserve also tighten money and credit and raise interest rates. And when they do that, that creates less buying power because when they say, okay, now you can't spend as much money and the prices are going high, but they do that in their crude way of trying to reduce inflation. But you get it from both ends, the higher prices and then the higher interest rates you have to pay and also and the higher debt service costs and also less availability of money. So it's a squeeze, like the squeeze that happened in the 1970s.
So does that mean, if someone is hearing this and they're thinking, okay, inflation's going up, the buying power is going down, this is a squeeze, is this going to happen for 5 years, 10 years? Is it eventually going to level out? What should we be expecting, do you think?
These things go in paradigm shifts that quite often take a relatively long time because everybody's mindset is in a paradigm shift. Everybody's mindset is in a certain place and they're doing certain things. For example, investors think that cash is safe and they don't pay much attention to inflation. And then what happens is they get inflation and they realize that if I'm holding cash, I'm losing buying power. Mm-hmm. So then they shift. They sell out their cash or they sell out their bonds and they put that into other things. And when they do that, that also contributes to inflation. Changes like that also happen in a lot of ways, like cost of living increases in compensation. Where in the past, when they don't worry about inflation, then they don't think about, do I have an inflation-linked contract for my work? Right. Or do I have enough inflation assets? It might be, do I need to buy, I'm going to store my money in a house or I might store my things. And so that pendulum swing from one mindset and one positioning to another mindset and another positioning in the early stages tends to be self-reinforcing. Those actions produce more inflation and more inflation psychology until that goes to the opposite extreme. Like in the 1970s, that people were surprised about what happened because they weren't used to inflation much. Then you had the inflation, and in the beginning, it swung. And then at the end of it, they said inflation will never end, and everybody's positioned for it never ending. And then, of course, what happens is it's so bad that then the central bank goes the opposite extreme, and then they get surprised. And so the 80s was a period which was the exact opposite of the 70s, where you have falling inflation, high real interest rates, and so on. And so the worst assets to own in the 70s were bonds, and the best assets to own in the 80s were bonds. So you see these pendulum swings that way.
So what would you say are the best assets to own in this decade?
Well, the best assets to not own, that's the most important thing, I think, is cash. And quoted, cash is trash. There will be a tightening here for the time being, and that tightening will have an effect. It'll hurt asset prices and so on. But cash is not the asset to own, and bonds are not good to own, in my opinion, because it's debt. It's owning somebody's debt, and you won't get a return. Think of it: the interest rate will not reach the inflation rate. So that's the problem. So you'll have that to walk. Then what you have to have, I think most importantly, is a well-diversified portfolio of other assets. Diversification is a very powerful tool because it can reduce risks without reducing expected returns. Now, there's lots of ways of getting what you think good investments are. They might be things you know about and the local businesses and so on, or they might be stocks, or they could be maybe a little gold or maybe a little bit foreign investing. Diversification is very important to do that in a balanced way. So I would generally say that that would be what I would recommend. I knew that I had to go have the great upside and not be constrained by the risk. And so I did the two things that I've described, but going into the puzzle, I found that it was great that to find people who could see things that I couldn't see and vice versa, so that we were on the mission